There's nothing quite like the ache of being invisible your entire life. For 28 years, Alira has swept the royal halls, knowing she would never matter to anyone who walked them. In the kingdom of Valdris, Omegas like her exist to serve. In silence, she tends the fires, scrubs the stones, and watches from the shadows as others live the lives she'll never have. When King Daemon opens his court to choose a queen, noble daughters parade before him with their titles and gold. But Alira sees something in the battle-worn king that others miss, a loneliness that mirrors her own. While everyone else offers him power and alliance, she steps forward with trembling hands and asks the question that will change everything. What could make a servant girl risk her life to speak to the most powerful man in the realm? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stone floors of Castle Valdris had worn smooth under Alira's feet over the years, each crack and uneven joint as familiar as the lines on her own palms. She moved through the corridors before dawn, her soft leather shoes making barely a whisper, against the ancient stones. The castle slept around her, its grand tapestries and golden fixtures catching the first pale light that filtered through the tall windows. This was her world, the spaces between spaces, the moments when no one was watching. She knew every servant's passage, every hidden door, every corner where she could disappear if a noble approached. In the kingdom of Valdris, Omegas learned early to become invisible. It was a survival skill as essential as breathing. Alira paused before the great hearth in the king's private chambers, where embers from the previous night still glowed like tiny stars in the ash. She knelt and began rebuilding the fire, her movements practiced and precise. As the kindling caught, the flames danced across a smooth stone embedded in the hearth's base, the royal hearthstone, said to glow brighter when truth was spoken near it. Old wives' tales most called it, but Alira had noticed its strange behavior over the years. She touched the simple brass pendant at her throat, the only thing her mother had left behind. The metal was worn smooth from years of nervous touching, its original design long since faded. She'd been found as an infant in the castle's lower chambers, clutching this necklace with nothing else to identify her origins. The kindly cook, Marta, had taken her in rather than send her to the workhouses. Child of no one, belonging to everyone, Marta used to say with a sad smile. It meant Alira could stay, could work, could earn her keep, but she would never truly belong. The fire caught properly now, flames reaching toward the chimney with hungry fingers. Alira sat back on her heels and allowed herself a moment to imagine what it might feel like to belong somewhere. To have someone look for her when she didn't appear to matter. The sound of boots in the corridor sent her scrambling to her feet. She grabbed her cleaning supplies and melted into the shadows, just as King Daemon entered his chambers, still wearing his ceremonial robes from the late council meeting. Even at 53, he moved with the fluid grace of a trained warrior, though Alira could see the weight of countless battles in the way his shoulders carried themselves. She'd watched him for years, from the corners of rooms, invisible as furniture. While other servants whispered about his legendary conquests and political maneuvering, Alira saw something different. In the quiet moments between his public performances, she glimpsed a man who seemed as alone as she felt. His marriage had been a political alliance that ended with his wife's death in childbirth 15 years ago. The child hadn't survived either. Since then, he'd ruled alone. Proposals came regularly from neighboring kingdoms, seeking alliances through marriage, but King Daemon had dismissed them all, until now. The pressure had been mounting for months. Lord Chancellor Aldrich, a thin man with calculating eyes, visited, daily with new arguments about the necessity of an heir. The kingdom needed stability, he insisted. The nobles needed reassurance that the royal line would continue. Alira had overheard enough conversations while tending fires and polishing furniture to understand the delicate political situation. 3 neighboring kingdoms watched Valdris with growing interest, waiting for any sign of weakness. A childless king approaching his later years represented opportunity to ambitious rulers. From her hiding spot behind a heavy curtain, she watched the king remove his crown and set it on the mantle. The gold was dented in several places, battle scars from his younger days when he'd fought alongside his soldiers rather than commanding from a safe distance. Even his crown carried the weight of his choices. "Tomorrow," he said to the empty room, his voice carrying a weariness that made Alira's heart ache. "Tomorrow I choose a queen." The announcement had been made that morning throughout the kingdom. Noble families would present their daughters, each one polished and prepared like prizes. At market, Alira had helped dress several of them over the years. Lady Cordelia with her sharp wit and sharper tongue, Lady Isabel who spoke 4 languages but had never shown kindness to a servant, Lady Morgana whose beauty was matched only by her cruelty. They would stand before the king tomorrow, each one offering what her family could provide: armies, gold, trade agreements, political connections. It was how royal marriages worked. Love was a luxury that kings could not afford. The king moved to his window, gazing out at the kingdom that stretched beyond the castle walls. In the distance, cooking fires from the village flickered like earthbound stars. Those were Alira's own people, the forgotten ones who worked the fields and tended the shops, who lived and died without anyone recording their names in history books. "What do you see out there, my king?" she whispered to herself, knowing he couldn't hear her. As if sensing her presence, Daemon turned slightly. For a moment, Alira's heart stopped, thinking she'd been discovered. But his eyes moved past her hiding spot, unfocused and lost in thought. She'd served in this castle for 28 years, and not once had he truly looked at her. Not once had any of them seen her as more than a useful shadow. Tomorrow, noble ladies would compete for his attention with practiced smiles and rehearsed words. They would offer him everything except what she could see he truly needed, someone who understood what it meant to be alone. The thought formed slowly in her mind. So dangerous, she almost dismissed it immediately. But as she watched the king's reflection in the dark window, she saw her own face, ghost-like beside his. 2 lonely souls, separated by everything the world said mattered, yet united by the thing it claimed didn't: the deep, aching need to be. Seen, Marta had always told her that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was acting, despite the terror that made your hands shake. As Alira gathered her cleaning supplies and slipped from the king's chambers, that dangerous thought took root and began to grow. Tomorrow, while duchesses and generals' daughters offered King Daemon their family's power, perhaps it was time. Someone offered him something else entirely. Perhaps it was time someone asked not what he could give, but what he needed to receive. The royal hearthstone pulsed once in the darkness behind her, as if responding to the truth beginning to form. In her heart, the great hall had been transformed into a showcase of feminine perfection. Silk banners in jewel tones draped from the vaulted ceiling, and arrangements of exotic flowers filled every corner with their cloying sweetness. Alira pressed herself against the servants' entrance, barely breathing as she watched the spectacle unfold. King Daemon sat upon his throne, wearing the war-torn crown that had become his signature. The dents and scratches in the gold caught the morning light, a stark reminder of the battles that had forged both the kingdom and the man who ruled it. His face remained impassive as Lord Chancellor Aldrich announced each candidate with flourishing. "Ceremony. Lady Cordelia of House Ravencrest," Aldrich proclaimed, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. "Daughter of Duke Marcus, commander of the Eastern armies, offering alliance with the coastal territories and a dowry of 50,000 gold sovereigns." Lady Cordelia stepped forward in a gown of midnight blue silk, her auburn hair twisted into an elaborate arrangement that must have taken hours to create. She curtsied with practiced precision, her smile never wavering even as she recited the speech her tutors had no doubt drilled into her for weeks. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice carrying the confident tone of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. House Ravencrest offers not merely gold and soldiers, but a partnership that will secure your kingdom's eastern borders for generations to come. I have been educated in statecraft, diplomacy, and the management of great households. I speak the languages of your neighboring kingdoms and understand the delicate art of political alliance." The king nodded politely, his expression revealing nothing. Alira found herself studying his face, searching for some sign of interest or connection. She saw only the careful mask of a ruler performing his duty. "Lady Isabel of House Thornwick," Aldrich continued, and the presentation began again. This time, the offer included trading routes through the southern provinces and connections to the powerful merchant guilds. Lady Isabel's speech was flawless, her credentials impeccable. She was beautiful, accomplished, and utterly perfect for the role of queen. The pattern continued for nearly an hour. Each lady was announced, each dowry detailed, each alliance explained with mathematical precision. They were all magnificent in their own ways, educated, beautiful, wealthy, connected. Any one of them would make an excellent political match. And yet Alira watched the king's face grow more distant with each presentation, as if he were retreating somewhere deep inside himself where duty couldn't reach. She recognized that look. It was the same expression she wore when nobles discussed her presence, as if she were a piece of furniture. "Lady Morgana of House Blackthorn," Aldrich announced with particular enthusiasm, "daughter of General Theron, offering the alliance of the northern armies and access to the richest iron mines in the kingdom." Lady Morgana was perhaps the most striking of all the candidates, with silver-blonde hair and eyes the color of winter ice. Her gown was cloth of gold, and diamonds sparkled at her throat. When she spoke, her voice held the kind of authority that came from a lifetime of command. "Your Majesty," she said, not bothering with the elaborate courtesy the others had shown, "I offer you more than gold or armies. I offer you a queen who understands power. Together, we could expand your kingdom's borders, bring the neighboring realms under your rule, and create an empire that would last for centuries." For the first time, King Daemon's expression shifted slightly. Not with interest, Alira realized, but with something closer to resignation. Lady Morgana represented everything a king was supposed to want: ambition, strength, the promise of conquest, and expansion. "Thank you, Lady Morgana," he said quietly. "Your offer is substantial." Lord Chancellor Aldrich stepped forward, clearly expecting the king to make his choice from among the presented candidates. The assembled nobles murmured among themselves, placing bets on which alliance would prove most appealing. It was a game to them, a fascinating display of political maneuvering, with a crown as the prize. And that was when Alira felt something inside her chest crack open like an egg. All her life, she had watched from the sidelines while others made choices that would shape her world. She had accepted her invisibility as natural law, as unchangeable as the movement of the seasons. But standing in that great hall, watching a good man prepare to cage himself in another loveless political arrangement, she finally understood what Marta had meant about courage. Her hands trembled as she stepped away from the wall. Several servants noticed her movement and tried to wave her back, their eyes wide with alarm. Moving during a royal ceremony was forbidden for someone of her station, but Alira kept walking, her soft shoes whispering against the marble floor. That murmur of conversation slowly died as nobles became aware of her approach. By the time she reached the center of the hall, absolute silence had fallen over the assembly. She could feel hundreds of eyes upon her, could sense the scandal building like a storm. King Daemon's gaze found hers, and for the first time in 28 years, he truly looked at her. Not through her, not around her, but at her, the moment, stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying clearly through the vast space. She hadn't planned what to say, hadn't rehearsed elegant words or prepared political arguments. She had only the truth that had been growing in her heart, like a tender shoot reaching toward sunlight. I have no armies to offer you, no gold, no lands, no political connections. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, fueled by something she'd never felt before, the reckless freedom of having nothing left to lose. I have no education in statecraft or languages. I cannot expand your kingdom's borders or secure trade agreements. The shocked silence deepened. Several nobles began to whisper furiously among themselves. This was unprecedented, scandalous, a violation of every protocol that governed their world. But Alira kept her eyes on the king's face, and she saw something there that made her heart race. Not anger or dismissal, but curiosity. For the first time all morning, he looked truly awake, truly present. What I can offer you, she continued, her voice now steady with certainty, is someone who sees you not as a king to be used, but as a man to be cherished. Someone who has watched you carry the weight of this kingdom alone for 15 years, and who wishes, her voice caught slightly but she pressed on, who wishes she could help you bear that burden. She took a breath that felt like diving off a cliff. Your Majesty, will you be my husband? The explosion of outrage was immediate. Nobles leaped to their feet, their voices raised in indignant protest. Lord Chancellor Aldrich's face turned purple with rage as he sputtered about protocol and proper procedures. Several guards moved forward, hands reaching for their weapons, but King Daemon raised a single hand, and the chaos stopped, as if he had cast a spell. What is your name? He asked quietly. Alira, Your Majesty. I tend the fires and clean the chambers. Alira. He repeated her name as if testing how it sounded in his mouth. You have served in my castle for many years. Since I was an infant, Your Majesty, 28 years. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, recognition, perhaps even wonder. 28 years. And I have never truly seen you until now. The admission hung in the air between them, more intimate than any declaration of love. In that moment, Alira realized she had done something no noble daughter could do. She had surprised him, awakened something in him that political necessity had been slowly killing. Guards, Lord Chancellor Aldrich commanded, his voice shaking. With outrage, remove this person immediately. This is an insult to His Majesty and to our honored guests. But again, the king's raised hand stopped all movement. His eyes never left Alira's face as he spoke. No, he said simply. I would hear what she has to say. The hall erupted again, but Alira barely heard the chaos. All her attention was focused on the man sitting before her, the man who had just chosen to listen to a servant girl, rather than dismiss her like an inconvenient interruption. For the first time in her life, she was truly seen. And in the depths of his battle-weary eyes, she glimpsed something that made her heart soar. Hope. The servants' quarters had never felt smaller. Alira sat on her narrow cot, still wearing the simple brown dress she'd worn to the selection ceremony, while a dozen voices crashed over her like breaking waves. The tarnished servant's bell that hung by her door, the same bell that had summoned her to countless thankless tasks, now seemed to mock her with its familiar weight. Have you lost your mind completely? Sarah, the head housemaid, paced back and forth in the cramped space. Do you understand what you've done? You've humiliated every noble family in the kingdom, not to mention insulting His Majesty, added Thomas, one of the stable boys. Kings don't marry servants, Alira. It's not how the world works. But Marta, sitting heavily in the room's only chair, remained quiet. Her weathered hands worked steadily at her knitting, needles clicking in a rhythm that had always soothed Alira's troubled thoughts. The elderly cook had said nothing since returning from the great hall, where she'd witnessed the entire scene from the servants' gallery. They're saying you should be flogged, whispered Elena, the youngest of the laundry maids. Lord Aldrich is furious. He's been meeting with the other nobles all afternoon. Alira touched the brass pendant at her throat, drawing comfort from its familiar weight. I spoke the truth, she said quietly. Nothing more. Truth. Sarah's voice cracked with hysteria. The truth is that you've doomed us all. When they decide you're too dangerous to keep around, do you think they'll stop with just you? We're all servants here, Alira. They'll assume we put you up to it, encouraged this madness." The fear in Sarah's voice made Alira's stomach clench. She hadn't considered that her actions might bring consequences down on the other servants. In her moment of courage, she'd been thinking only of herself and the king. But of course, the nobles would look for conspirators, would assume this had been planned rather than the desperate impulse it had been. "I'll tell them it was entirely my idea," Alira said. "I'll make sure they know none of you were involved." "You think they'll listen to you?" Thomas shook his head in disbelief. "You're nobody, Alira. Less than nobody now. You're a scandal, an embarrassment they need to make disappear." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of heavy boots in the corridor outside. The servants fell silent, instinctively pressing themselves against the walls as if trying to disappear into the stone. But when the door opened, it wasn't guards who entered, it was the king himself. The small room seemed to shrink further with his presence. King Daemon had to duck slightly to avoid hitting his head on the low ceiling, and his broad shoulders nearly touched both walls. He'd changed from his ceremonial robes into simple traveling clothes, but there was no mistaking his identity or authority. Every servant in the room immediately dropped to their knees, heads bowed in terrified submission. All except Alira, who found herself frozen in place, staring at him in shock. "Leave us," he said quietly, and the other servants scrambled toward the door like mice fleeing a cat. Only Marta remained, her knitting needles still clicking steadily. "You, too, good woman," the king said, but Marta shook her head. "Been looking after this child for 28 years, she said calmly. "Not about to stop now, your majesty, but I'll be quiet as a shadow." Something that might have been amusement flickered across the king's features. He nodded once, then turned his attention to Alira. "Stand," he said. She rose on unsteady legs, acutely aware of her simple clothing, her work-roughened hands, her complete lack of royal deportment, in the close confines of the servants' quarters, with no ceremony or protocol to provide a barrier between them. She felt more vulnerable than she had in the great hall. "Tell me about your mother," he said. The request caught her completely off guard. "Your Majesty, your mother. You were found as an infant, I'm told, with only this necklace." His eyes focused on the brass pendant at her throat. "What do you know of her?" "Nothing, your Majesty. Marta found me in the lower chambers. She took me in rather than send me to the workhouses." Alira glanced at the elderly cook, who continued her knitting without looking up. "This necklace was all I had." The king studied her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could read thoughts she hadn't even formed yet. "You have her eyes," he said finally, "your Majesty." But he didn't elaborate, instead walking to the single small window that looked out over the castle courtyard. From here, they could see the noble families departing in their elaborate carriages, no doubt carrying word of the day's scandal to every corner of the kingdom. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked without turning around. "I spoke from my heart, your Majesty. You've created a political crisis that could destabilize the entire kingdom." His voice was matter-of-fact, without heat. "Lord Aldrich has already received messages from 3 neighboring rulers, questioning my fitness to rule if I can't maintain proper protocols in my own court." Alira felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead cloak. "I never intended—" "What did you intend?" Now he did turn, pinning her with those dark eyes. "When you stepped forward today, what did you hope would happen?" The question was simple, but the answer felt enormous. How could she explain the feeling that had driven her forward, the conviction that she'd seen something in him that no one else had noticed? "I wanted you to know that someone saw you," she said finally. "Not the king, not the crown, not the political alliances you could provide. Just you, the man who carries the weight of everyone's expectations and never asks what he might need for himself." For a long moment he simply stared at her. Then, to her complete amazement, he laughed, a sound with little humor in it. "You think I'm lonely," he said. "I know you are, your Majesty, because I recognize it. And you think marriage would solve that loneliness? Alira considered the question seriously. I think partnership might. Having someone who sees your struggles and wishes to share them, rather than add to them. The king was quiet for so long that Alira began to wonder if she'd overstepped irrevocably. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. I married once for political alliance, Lady Catherine of House Monterey. She was beautiful, accomplished, and deeply unhappy from the day she arrived at this castle. We were strangers who shared a bed and formal meals, nothing more. When she died in childbirth, I grieved for the child we lost, but I cannot honestly say I grieved for her. The admission hung in the small room like incense, heavy and sacred. Alira realized he had never spoken these words aloud before, had never allowed anyone to see this private pain. For 15 years, I've told myself that was enough, he continued. That duty was enough, that the kingdom's needs mattered more than my own. But today, when you asked your impossible question, something awakened in me that I thought had died with my youth. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines that years of difficult decisions had carved around his eyes. I cannot marry you, he said gently. You understand this, don't you? The political consequences alone would be catastrophic. Alira nodded, though her heart clenched with disappointment. I understand, Your Majesty, but I find myself reluctant to forget what you said, or to pretend I didn't see the truth in your eyes when you said it. Hope flickered in her chest like a candle flame in wind. What does that mean, Your Majesty? It means, he said, reaching out to touch the brass pendant at her throat with surprising gentleness, that perhaps it's time I learn more about the woman who has served in my castle for 28 years, without my notice. And perhaps it's time you learned that some truths, once spoken, cannot be taken back. The servant's bell chimed once. In the evening breeze, as if blessing this impossible conversation between a king and a servant girl who had dared to ask for love. 3 days passed before the summons came. Alira had spent those days in a strange limbo, neither punished nor forgotten, while the castle buzzed with whispered speculation. Some servants avoided her entirely, afraid of guilt by association. Others sought her out, hungry for details about her private conversation with the king. Through it all, Marta remained a steady presence, saying little but watching everything with her sharp, knowing eyes. The royal correspondence seal pressed into the wax looked different somehow when it bore her name. Alira stared at the small piece of parchment, hardly daring to believe it was real. The message was brief and formal. She was to present herself to the king's private study at sunset. Well, Marta asked, looking up from the bread she was kneading, he wants to see me again. The old cook's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. Course he does. Man's got eyes in his head, hasn't he? But Alira felt only anxiety as the sun traced its arc across the sky. What could King Daemon want with her now? Had he changed his mind about letting her stay in the castle? Was this formal dismissal, delivered privately to spare them both embarrassment? The king's private study was smaller than his formal chambers, lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books and maps of distant kingdoms. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across walls decorated with weapons from his younger days as a warrior. It felt more like a retreat than a throne room, a place where a man might go to think rather than to rule. King Daemon stood with his back to her, studying a map spread across a heavy oak table. He'd removed his formal crown, and his dark hair showed more silver in the firelight than she'd noticed before. When he turned at her entrance, she saw that he'd traded his royal robes for simple clothes, well made, but without the elaborate decoration that usually marked his status. "Thank you for coming," he said, as if she'd had any choice in the matter. "Your Majesty." She curtsied, then remained standing uncertainly near the door. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of 2 chairs positioned near the fire. "Please." The invitation to sit in his presence was so unprecedented that for a moment she wondered if she'd misheard. But his expression was patient, waiting, so she carefully lowered herself into the offered chair. The leather was buttery soft, worn smooth by years of use. "Wine?" he asked, moving to a side table where a decanter waited. Your Majesty, I don't know if that's appropriate. Tonight, nothing about this is appropriate." He poured 2 glasses of deep red wine and handed her one before settling into the chair across from her. "3 days ago, you asked me a question that has made it impossible for me to think of anything else." Alira's heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm sorry if I've caused you distress, Your Majesty." "Are you?" His dark eyes searched her face. "Are you truly sorry you asked it?" The question demanded honesty. "No, Your Majesty, I'm not sorry. I meant every word." "Even knowing the chaos it's caused?" She thought of the angry nobles, the frightened servants, the political complications she'd created with her moment of reckless courage. "Even then," he nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he'd been wondering about. "Tell me about your life here, your real life, not the duties you perform. What do you think about when you're tending fires and scrubbing floors?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her about her inner thoughts before. I watch people, Your Majesty. I listen. When you're invisible, you see things others don't notice." "What kinds of things?" She hesitated, uncertain how much truth he actually wanted, but his expression encouraged her to continue. "I see how lonely everyone is," she said finally. "The nobles with their political games and arranged marriages. The servants who work until they drop because they have no other choice. Even the guards who stand at attention for hours, protecting people who barely see them as human. And what do you see when you watch me?" The personal nature of the question made heat rise in her cheeks. "I see a man who carries everyone else's needs but has forgotten his own, who makes decisions that affect thousands of lives but has no one to talk to about the weight of those choices." "Go on." "I see someone who married for duty once and found it hollow, who's being asked to do it again and dreads repeating that emptiness." She paused, then added quietly, "I see someone who's forgotten what it feels like to be wanted for himself, rather than his crown." The king was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "You see a great deal for someone who claims to be invisible. Invisible people often see the most, Your Majesty. We have nothing else to do but watch and listen." He turned to study her with that intense focus that made her feel exposed and treasured at the same time. "What do you want from life, Alira? If you could have anything, be anything, what would you choose?" Another question no one had ever asked her. She considered it seriously, aware that her answer might shape whatever came next between them. "I want to matter," she said finally. "Not to everyone, just to someone. I want to wake up in the morning, knowing that my presence in the world makes a difference to at least one person. I want to love someone and be loved in return, not for what I can provide or what advantages I bring, but for who I am underneath all the roles and expectations. And you think you could find that with a king? I think I could find that with you," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "Not because you're a king, but because of who you are when the crown comes off. The man I glimpsed in your chambers that night, standing at the window and looking so tired he could barely hold himself upright. That's the man I asked to marry me." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. King Daemon set down his wineglass and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I have a confession to make," he said. "I've been asking questions about you, quiet questions, to people who might know your history." Alira's pulse quickened. "What kind of questions?" "About how you came to be here. About your mother. About that necklace you wear." His eyes focused on the brass pendant at her throat. "It's not as simple as it appears, is it?" "I don't understand, Your Majesty. The brass is a facade, carefully applied over something much more valuable, and the design, though worn, follows patterns used in royal jewelry from a generation ago." Alira's hand flew to her throat, fingers closing protectively around the pendant. "That's impossible. This was all my mother left me. Marta said she was just a servant who died giving birth." "Marta may have believed that," the king said gently, "but I'm beginning to suspect your mother's story is more complicated than anyone realized." The room seemed to tilt around her. Everything she'd believed about herself, about her place in the world, suddenly felt uncertain. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that perhaps your question wasn't as impossible as we both believed. Perhaps fate has been working toward this moment longer than either of us imagined." He reached out and gently touched the pendant, his fingers warm against her skin. "And perhaps it's time we discovered the truth about who you really are." Outside the study windows, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, bearing witness to the moment when a servant girl's world began to transform in ways she'd never dared to dream. The royal gardens had always been forbidden territory for servants, but the small iron key King Daemon pressed into Alira's palm changed everything. Its weight was insignificant, but the trust it represented felt enormous. Access to a private space where they could meet away from the prying eyes and wagging tongues of the court. "The Rose Garden," he said quietly as they parted that evening. "Tomorrow at sunset." The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Alira went through her usual duties, tending fires, cleaning chambers, helping in the kitchens, but her mind kept drifting to the key hidden in her pocket and what it might mean. The other servants noticed her distraction, but after 3 days of whispered speculation about her relationship with the king, they'd grown tired of trying to extract information she wasn't ready to share. The Rose Garden sat in the heart of the castle's grounds, surrounded by high hedges that provided privacy from curious observers. Ancient climbing roses covered arbors and trellises, their blooms filling the air with heady sweetness. A small fountain bubbled at the center, its gentle sound masking the possibility of eavesdropping. King Daemon was already there when she arrived, sitting on a stone bench beside the fountain. He'd changed from his formal attire into simple clothes again, dark wool and leather that made him look more like a prosperous merchant than a ruler. The transformation was becoming familiar, this shedding of his royal persona in her presence. "I wasn't certain you'd come," he said as she approached. "Did you think I wouldn't?" She settled beside him on the bench, careful to maintain proper distance despite the intimacy of their surroundings. "I thought you might have decided this was too dangerous, too complicated." He turned to study her profile in the golden light. "You still could, you know, walk away from whatever this is becoming between us." "Is that what you want me to do?" "No," he said immediately, "but I want you to know you have the choice." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, listening to the fountain and the evening songs of birds settling into their roosts. Finally, Alira found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind all day. "What did you discover about my mother?" King Daemon reached into his vest and withdrew a small leather portfolio. "I had the castle's historians search through old records. What they found is intriguing." He opened the portfolio and showed her a document written in faded ink. The handwriting was formal, official, but she could make out few of the words in the failing light. 29 years ago," he said, "a young woman arrived at this castle requesting sanctuary. She was pregnant, alone, and refused to give her real name. The records show she was granted shelter in the servants' quarters, where she gave birth to a daughter before dying from complications a few days later." Alira's heart clenched. "My mother, the woman who found you, Marta, reported the birth and death to the castle steward, but there are inconsistencies in the records, small things that suggest whoever this woman was, she was more than a common servant seeking charity." "What kind of inconsistencies?" "Her clothes, for one thing. The inventory lists silk undergarments and jewelry of exceptional quality. And this," he showed her another document, this one bearing an official seal. A letter of credit from the Bank of Astoria guaranteeing payment for her care and the child's upbringing. Someone with significant resources was ensuring you'd Be looked after. Alira stared at the documents, trying to process their implications. But why the secrecy? Why not acknowledge me openly if she had means? That's what I intend to find out. His voice carried a determination she found both thrilling and terrifying. I've sent messages to contacts in neighboring kingdoms, people who might remember a noble lady who disappeared around that time. The possibility that she might not be the nobody she'd always believed herself to be was overwhelming. All her life she'd accepted her low station as natural law. Now King Daemon was suggesting that acceptance had been based on incomplete information. "Does any of this change how you see me?" she asked quietly. "It changes how I understand your courage in approaching me," he said. "Perhaps speaking to kings runs in your blood." Despite her confusion, she smiled at that. "And does it change anything else about what's possible between us?" He was quiet for so long, she began to fear she'd pushed too far. When he finally answered, his voice was thoughtful. "It changes the political calculations, certainly. If you prove to be of noble birth, the scandal of my interest becomes manageable. The nobles could accept a forgotten princess far more easily than a servant. But it doesn't change what I feel when I look at you. Whether you're the daughter of a princess or a kitchen maid, you're still the woman who saw through all my defenses and asked the question no one else dared to voice." He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. The contact sent warmth racing up her arm and settling somewhere near her heart. "These past few days, I've found myself thinking about our conversations more than affairs of state. When I wake in the morning, I wonder what you're doing, whether you're safe, if you're thinking of me. I haven't felt this way since—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I've never felt this way, not even in my youth." "Daemon," she said softly, using his name without his title for the first time. "Yes, whatever we discover about my parentage, whatever the political consequences, I want you to know, I didn't ask you to marry me because I hoped to become queen. I asked because I thought we might save each other from loneliness." He lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "And do you still think that's possible?" More now than ever, as if summoned by her words, a commotion erupted beyond the garden hedges, shouting voices, running feet, the clash of steel on steel. King Daemon was on his feet immediately, his hand moving instinctively to the sword he always wore, even in casual clothes. "Stay behind me," he ordered, moving toward the garden entrance. But Alira had grown up in this castle, knew its sounds and rhythms better than most. What she heard wasn't a general attack or uprising. It was targeted, focused, headed in their direction. "It's an assassination attempt," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "They're coming for us." King Daemon's jaw tightened as the sounds grew closer. "For me, you mean?" "No," Alira said, understanding with cold clarity that her life had just become infinitely more dangerous. "For both of us. I think someone very much wants to prevent us from discovering what we might find about my past." The first masked figure appeared at the garden entrance just as the last light faded from the sky, and Alira realized that her quiet life as an invisible servant had ended forever. The poisoned goblet sat on Lord Aldrich's desk like an accusation, its silver surface dulled by the deadly residue that had been meant for Alira's lips. King Daemon stared at it with barely contained fury, his knuckles white where they gripped the chair back. "Nightshade," the court physician reported grimly. "Enough to kill a dozen people, if she'd taken even a sip." The attack in the Rose Garden, 3 nights earlier, had been only the beginning. What had started as a simple assassination attempt by masked intruders had escalated into something far more sinister. A calculated campaign to eliminate Alira before she could learn the truth about her heritage. "The wine was delivered to her quarters with your seal, Your Majesty," Captain Marcus, head of the Royal Guard, explained. "If not for the servant girl's suspicion about receiving such an expensive gift, she'd be dead now." Alira sat quietly in the corner of the Lord Chancellor's office, still shaken by how close she'd come to death. Elena, the young laundry maid, had probably saved her life by questioning why a servant would receive wine from the king's personal reserves. The girls' suspicion had prompted them to test the wine on a rat first, a rat that had died within minutes. "Who has access to the royal seal?" King Daemon's voice was dangerously quiet. Lord Aldrich shifted uncomfortably. "The senior members of the council, the captain of guards, myself. Perhaps a dozen people in total. Then we have a traitor in our inner circle." The words hung in the air like a sword, waiting to fall. Alira watched the faces around the room, trying to read guilt or innocence in their expressions. These were men who had served the kingdom for decades, who had sworn oaths of loyalty with their hands on sacred texts. The idea that one of them was trying to murder her felt surreal. "Your Majesty," Lord Aldrich said carefully, "perhaps we should consider that this situation has become untenable. The danger to both you and the young woman continues to escalate. Perhaps it would be wiser to what?" King Daemon's voice cut like a blade. "Abandon her to these assassins? Pretend that whatever conspiracy is unfolding will simply disappear if we ignore it? To consider the greater good of the kingdom," Aldrich replied stiffly. "Your safety is paramount, Your Majesty. If associating with this woman puts you at risk—" "The woman has a name," Daemon said quietly. "Her name is Alira, and she is under my personal protection." The declaration sent visible ripples through the assembled council members. Personal protection from the king was not granted lightly. It was typically reserved for visiting royalty or essential allies. By extending it to Alira, King Daemon was making a statement about her importance that no one could ignore. "Your Majesty," Captain Marcus interjected, "we've been investigating the broader conspiracy. What we've found suggests this goes beyond simple opposition to your relationship. Someone is very determined to prevent Miss Alira from discovering her true parentage." King Daemon turned to the captain with sharp interest. "What have you learned?" "The attackers in the Rose Garden weren't common criminals. Their weapons were too fine, their training too advanced, and we found this on one of the bodies." He produced a small medallion bearing an unfamiliar crest, a silver wolf on a black field. "I don't recognize it," Lord Aldrich said, studying the medallion with a frown, but Alira felt a chill of recognition. "I've seen that symbol before," she said quietly, "on a letter that came from my mother shortly before she died. Marta showed it to me years later when I was old enough to understand." Every head in the room turned toward her. King Daemon leaned forward intently. "What kind of letter?" "Marta said it was a demand, someone claiming she had something that belonged to them, threatening to take it back by force if necessary." Alira touched the brass pendant at her throat unconsciously. "Marta thought they were referring to me." The pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. King Daemon's expression hardened as the implications became clear. "Someone wanted your mother to return you to them," he said slowly. "When she refused and fled here for sanctuary, they followed. But she died before they could reclaim whatever they believed they owned. And now," Alira asked, though she feared she already knew the answer, "now they've realized you're still alive and that we're investigating your past. They can't allow you to discover who you really are, because that knowledge poses a threat to them." Lord Aldrich cleared his throat diplomatically. "Your Majesty, with respect, we're building a rather elaborate theory on very little evidence. Perhaps the simpler explanation is that certain noble families are simply upset by recent developments and are taking extreme measures to preserve what they see as proper protocol." "You think Lady Morgana's family is behind this?" Captain Marcus asked skeptically. "I think powerful people don't appreciate being publicly embarrassed," Aldrich replied. "When a servant girl disrupts the most important political ceremony of the year, there are bound to be consequences." But King Daemon shook his head. "This isn't about embarrassment or protocol. This is about bloodlines and inheritance. Someone believes Alira has a claim to something they want to keep hidden," he began, pacing, his strategic mind clearly working through possibilities. "The timing isn't coincidental. For 28 years, no one cared about the orphaned servant girl in the castle, but the moment I showed interest in her, the moment we began investigating her past, the attack started. What does that suggest, Your Majesty? Captain Marcus asked. It suggests that my interest in her legitimizes her in ways that simple existence never could. If I'm willing to consider marrying her, others will begin to ask who she really is. And apparently that's a question someone is desperate to prevent being answered. Alira felt the weight of everyone's attention settling on her shoulders. Her quiet life as an invisible servant was becoming a political battlefield where the stakes seemed to grow higher every day. What do we do? She asked. King Daemon stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression resolute. We accelerate our investigation. Someone is trying very hard to keep us from learning the truth about your mother, which means the truth is worth killing for. I want to know why. Your Majesty, Lord Aldrich said urgently, surely caution would be wiser. If we stir this pot further, then we'll discover what's at the bottom of it. Daemon finished firmly. I've sent messages to 3 kingdoms asking about missing noble ladies from 29 years ago. Within the week, we should have answers. He moved to stand beside Alira's chair, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. And until we know who we're fighting and why, she doesn't leave the secure areas of the castle. I want guards with her at all times. Your Majesty, Alira protested. I don't need. You nearly died 3 times this week, he said gently but firmly. Once from masked assassins, once from poisoned wine, and once from a crossbow bolt that missed your head by inches while you were hanging laundry. I think we can agree you need protection. The concern in his voice, the possessive way his hand tightened on her shoulder, spoke volumes about how much his feelings had deepened in just a few days. It was both thrilling and terrifying to realize that she'd become precious to someone so powerful. What if the answers we find make everything more complicated? She asked quietly. Then we'll face those complications together, he replied without hesitation. Whatever your birth reveals, whatever political storms it creates, you won't face them alone. As the council meeting dispersed and plans were made for increased security, Alira remained seated, staring at the poisoned goblet that had come so close to ending her life. 3 days ago, she'd been nobody special, a servant girl with impossible dreams. Now she was at the center of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the kingdom, protected by a king who was risking everything to uncover her truth. The brass pendant at her throat seemed to pulse with sudden warmth, as if responding to the magnitude of what lay ahead. Soon, very soon, she would learn who she really was. And judging by the length someone was going to prevent that discovery, the truth was going to change everything. The faded royal portrait had been hidden behind a false panel in the castle's archive, wrapped in silk cloth that had protected it from light and time for nearly 3 decades. When Captain Marcus brought it to King Daemon's private study, the resemblance was unmistakable and shocking. Alira stared at her own face, looking back at her from the painted canvas, aged perhaps 20 years and wearing the elaborate court dress of a princess. The same dark eyes, the same delicate bone structure, even the same way of holding her head, slightly tilted when concentrating. But it was the jewelry in the portrait that made her knees weak with recognition. Around the painted woman's throat hung an elaborate necklace, the same pendant Alira had worn her entire life, but revealed in its true form. What she'd always believed was simple brass was actually gold filigree surrounding a sapphire the size of a robin's egg. The careful tarnish that had disguised its value for 28 years had been deliberately applied to hide its significance. Princess Lyanna of Astoria, King Daemon said quietly, reading from the documentation that had accompanied the portrait. Youngest daughter of King Edmund, who ruled the mountain kingdom to our north. She disappeared 29 years ago, 3 months, before her arranged marriage to Prince Victor of the Shadowlands. Alira sank into the chair beside the desk, overwhelmed. My mother was a princess, According to this, she fled her kingdom rather than marry a man known for his cruelty. King Edmund declared her dead rather than admit his daughter had defied him so publicly. But she made it here, to Valdris, where she found sanctuary long enough to give birth to you. The implications crashed over her in waves. She wasn't the nobody she'd believed herself to be. She was the daughter of a princess, granddaughter of a king, with royal blood flowing through her veins. But that blood had also painted a target on her back, one that had finally caught up with her after nearly 3 decades. The silver wolf medallion, she said, understanding flooding through her. It's the crest of the Shadowlands, isn't it, Prince? Victor's personal seal, Captain Marcus confirmed grimly. He never married after your mother's disappearance, never took another bride. According to our contacts, he spent the last 29 years claiming that Princess Lyanna was rightfully his, that their betrothal contract gave him legal claim to her and any children she might bear. King Daemon's jaw tightened with controlled fury. He's been hunting you your entire life. But why now, Alira asked. Why not try to take me years ago, when I was a child and defenseless? Because you were invisible then, Daemon replied. A servant girl in a foreign castle with no one to legitimize your claim or question your heritage. But the moment I showed interest in you, the moment word spread that the King of Valdris was considering you as a potential bride, everything changed. The political landscape shifted dramatically in Alira's mind as she grasped the full scope of what her heritage meant. If she married King Daemon, their children would carry the bloodlines of 3 kingdoms. Valdris through him, Astoria through her, and potentially claims on the Shadowlands through her mother's broken betrothal contract. Victor can't allow that, she said, understanding the assassin's desperation now. If I marry you and have children, those children could one day challenge his rule, couldn't they? More than that, Captain Marcus said. Princess Lyanna was King Edmund's youngest daughter, but she was also his designated heir. When she disappeared, the crown passed to her uncle's line. If you're acknowledged as her daughter, you have a legitimate claim to the throne of Astoria. The room fell silent as the magnitude of this revelation settled over them. Alira wasn't just a princess. She was potentially a queen in her own right, with hereditary claims that could reshape the balance of power across multiple kingdoms. No wonder someone's trying to kill me, she said faintly. King Daemon moved to kneel beside, a chair taking her hands in his. This changes everything, Alira. You understand that, don't you? It changes how others see me, she replied. But it doesn't change who I am. I'm still the same woman who asked you to marry her because she saw your loneliness and wanted to heal it. The nobles will no longer be able to object to our union on grounds of unequal status, he said. If anything, your bloodline is older and more distinguished than mine. And the political complications, enormous, he admitted, but manageable now that we understand what we're facing. Victor has been operating in secret, using assassins and poison because he couldn't move openly against you without acknowledging your legitimacy. But if we recognize you publicly as Princess Lyanna's daughter, he'll be forced to either press his claim through legal channels or risk war with multiple kingdoms. Lord Aldrich, who had been suspiciously quiet throughout these revelations, finally spoke. Your Majesty, surely we should proceed with extreme caution. Recognizing the young woman's claim could destabilize relations with both Astoria and the Shadowlands. Or it could strengthen them, King Daemon replied firmly. Astoria has been without a clear heir for 29 years. King Edmund's nephew, he sits on the throne, but he's old, and his own succession is disputed. Acknowledging Alira could actually bring stability to the region. Alira looked down at the pendant that had hidden its true nature for so long, much like she had hidden hers. The sapphire caught the firelight and threw blue sparkles across her hands, hands that had scrubbed floors and tended fires, but apparently carried royal blood. What happens now? She asked. Now we make you visible, King Daemon said with quiet Determination. We announce your true identity to the court and the kingdom. We make it impossible for Victor or anyone else to harm you in secret. And if that starts a war, then we fight it. But we fight it honestly, in the open, rather than cowering from shadows and poison. He lifted her chin so their eyes met. You asked me to marry you, Alira. Now I'm asking you, Princess Alira of Astoria, daughter of Princess Lyanna, heir to kingdoms and keeper of ancient bloodlines, will you still have me? Knowing that our union will reshape the political map of the known world. The question carried echoes of her own desperate proposal days ago, but the context had shifted dramatically. She was no longer a servant girl asking for love. She was a princess with the power to forge alliances, end conflicts, or start wars with her choice of husband. But when she looked into King Daemon's eyes, she saw the same loneliness that had moved her to speak that first day, the same need for genuine connection that transcended crowns and treaties. I will, she said simply, not because of the political advantages or the bloodlines or the kingdoms we might unite, but because you're the man who saw me when I was nobody, who listened when I was invisible, who chose to protect me before you knew I was worth protecting. He kissed her then, gently and reverently, sealing a promise that would echo through history. Outside the study windows, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, the literal and metaphorical tempests their union would surely bring. The faded portrait of Princess Lyanna seemed to smile down at them, blessing the love her sacrifice had made possible. Her daughter would not repeat her fate, fleeing in the night from unwanted suitors. Instead, Princess Alira would stand in the light, claim her heritage, and choose love on her own terms, whatever the cost might be. The crown jewels of truth had not been worn for over a century, locked away in the deepest vaults of the castle until this moment when politics and passion demanded their ancient power. The gems, sapphires, emeralds, and diamonds, arranged in patterns that seemed to shift and breathe in the torchlight, were said to reveal the true intentions of anyone who wore them, making lies impossible and hidden motives transparent. Alira stood before the mirror in the royal chambers that had been prepared for her, no longer dressed as a servant, but as the princess she had been born to be. The gown was midnight blue silk, embroidered with silver thread, a creation that had taken the castle's seamstresses 3 days of non-stop work to complete. Her hair had been arranged in elaborate braids woven with pearls, and the sapphire pendant, now revealed in its full glory, rested against her collarbone like a declaration of her true identity. But it was the approaching ceremony that made her hands tremble as she reached for the crown jewels of truth. "You don't have to do this," King Daemon said from behind her, his reflection joining hers in the mirror. He wore his finest royal regalia, the war-torn crown polished to gleaming perfection, but his eyes were troubled. "Yes, I do," she replied quietly. "Half the kingdom still believes I'm an imposter, that this is all an elaborate deception. The other half thinks you've lost your mind, letting passion cloud your judgment. The only way forward is absolute transparency." The past week had been a whirlwind of revelation and preparation. The official announcement of her true identity had sent shockwaves through the kingdom and beyond. Messengers had ridden day and night, carrying the news to neighboring realms, while the castle had swarmed with historians, genealogists, and political advisors trying to map the implications of her bloodline. Some nobles had immediately switched their allegiance, suddenly eager to curry favor with the newly revealed princess. Others remained skeptical, demanding proof that went beyond painted portraits and circumstantial evidence, and a dangerous few had aligned themselves with forces that wanted her eliminated entirely. Prince Victor himself had finally emerged from the shadows, sending an official delegation to Valdris with documents dating back nearly 3 decades. His claim was legally complex but emotionally simple. Princess Lyanna had been contracted to marry him, making any children she bore technically his property under the ancient laws of betrothal. He demanded Alira's immediate extradition to the Shadowlands for what he called proper evaluation of her legitimacy. King Daemon's response had been swift and unambiguous: over his dead body. But the political pressure was mounting from multiple directions. The current king of Astoria, Lyanna's cousin, who had inherited the throne after her disappearance, was sending his own delegation to verify Alira's claims. If acknowledged, she would supersede his children in the line of succession, potentially destabilizing his rule. 3 other kingdoms were watching carefully, ready to exploit any weakness or chaos that emerged from this unprecedented situation. The betrothal ceremony scheduled for tonight was meant to resolve all doubts simultaneously. By wearing the crown jewels of truth, while publicly declaring her intentions and heritage, Alira would make deception impossible. The gems would reveal whether her love for King Daemon was genuine or calculating, whether her claims to royal blood were authentic or fabricated, and whether her heart truly held the pure intentions she proclaimed. "The jewels will show everyone what I already know," Daemon said, stepping closer to place his hands on her shoulders. "That you are exactly who you claim to be. A woman who asked me to marry her not for power or position, but because you saw past my crown to the lonely man beneath. And if the gems reveal something different," she asked, "if there's some shadow in my heart I don't even recognize, then we'll face that truth together." His hands tightened reassuringly. "But I have no fear of what they'll show, Alira. I've seen your heart already, in moments when you thought no one was watching. I've seen your kindness to servants who couldn't help you rise in station, your genuine concern for the kingdom's welfare, your willingness to sacrifice your own safety to protect others." Outside their chambers, the sounds of preparation echoed through the castle. The great hall was being decorated with banners, representing not just Valdris but Astoria as well, acknowledging her dual heritage. Representatives from a dozen kingdoms had arrived to witness the ceremony, along with priests, nobles, and common citizens who had been granted special permission to attend. But darker preparations were also underway. Captain Marcus had uncovered evidence of at least 3 separate assassination plots timed to coincide with the ceremony. Archers would be positioned throughout the hall, guards stationed at every entrance, and the king's personal food taster had been working overtime to ensure no poison reached the royal table. "Victor's delegation arrived an hour ago," Daemon informed her grimly. "He didn't come himself. Too much of a coward for that, but he sent his nephew with an official protest and what amounts to a declaration of war if we proceed. And the delegation from Astoria, led by Prince Roderick, the current king's eldest son. He seems conflicted. Part of him appears genuinely curious about you, but he's also clearly concerned about what your existence means for his own inheritance." Alira turned from the mirror to face him directly. "Daemon, are you certain this is worth the risk? We could still call off the ceremony. Let me disappear back into the servants' quarters. Let the political storms calm." "No," his voice cut through her doubts with absolute certainty. "I will not let fear dictate the most important decision of my life. I will not let evil men with selfish motives destroy the best thing that's happened to this kingdom in decades." He cupped her face. In his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Besides," he added with a slight smile, "you've already set these events in motion the moment you asked me that impossible question. There's no going back now, only forward." A knock at the chamber door interrupted them. Captain Marcus entered with a formal bow. "Your Majesties, it's time. The hall is prepared, the witnesses assembled. The crown jewels of truth await." Alira took a deep breath, feeling the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders like a mantle. In a few minutes, she would walk into that great hall and submit herself to magical scrutiny that would reveal her deepest truths to hundreds of observers. Her love, her heritage, her intentions, her very soul would be laid bare for political judgment. "Ready?" Daemon asked, offering her his arm. She looked at him, this good man who had chosen to risk everything for love, who was about to stand beside her as she faced the consequences of her impossible courage, and felt her fears transform into determination. "Ready?" she said, placing her hand on his arm. Together they walked toward the great hall, where the crown jewels of truth waited to reveal whether a servant girl's love was strong enough to reshape the fate of kingdoms. The great hall had been transformed into something between a royal court and an arena of judgment. Hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, while banners from a dozen kingdoms hung from the vaulted ceiling like silent witnesses. The unity chalice sat on the high altar, its ancient silver gleaming with ceremonial oils that would seal whatever bonds were forged this night. Alira's entrance created a ripple of whispered amazement through the assembled crowd. Many were seeing her true appearance for the first time, not the invisible servant girl they'd dismissed for years, but the princess she had always been, beneath the disguise of common clothes and deliberately lowered eyes. The transformation was so complete that several nobles seemed genuinely shocked, as if they couldn't reconcile this elegant young woman with the shadow they'd barely noticed cleaning their chambers. But all eyes inevitably turned to the crown jewels of truth that rested on a velvet cushion beside the altar. Even in the candlelight, the gems seemed to pulse with their own inner fire, as if eager to fulfill their ancient purpose. Legend claimed they had been created by the first mages to settle in Valdris, imbued with magic that made deception impossible. In their presence, King Daemon stood waiting beside the altar, magnificent in his ceremonial robes, but somehow diminished by the weight of what they were about to attempt. This ceremony would determine not just their personal future, but the political fate of multiple kingdoms. If the jewels revealed any falsehood or hidden agenda, the consequences would be catastrophic. "Approach," called the high priest, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. Princess Alira of Astoria, daughter of the late Princess Lyanna, stepped forward to face the truth. The formal use of her title sent another murmur through the crowd. Many were still adjusting to the idea that the servant girl was actually royalty, that her bloodline was potentially more distinguished than their own. Alira walked toward the altar with measured steps, acutely conscious of the hundreds of eyes tracking her every movement. In the front rows sat the various delegations, Prince Roderick of Astoria, with his mixture of curiosity and concern, the Shadowlands representatives with barely concealed hostility, and dozens of other nobles calculating how this revelation might affect their own positions. "State your name and lineage," the high priest commanded. "I am Alira, daughter of Princess Lyanna of Astoria and an unknown father. I was born in this castle 28 years ago and raised as a servant, unaware of my true heritage, until recent discoveries revealed my royal blood." The high priest lifted the crown jewels from their cushion. The gems caught the candlelight and threw rainbow patterns across the assembled faces, beautiful and ominous in equal measure. "Do you swear to speak only truth while wearing these sacred gems? Do you understand that any falsehood, any deception, any hidden motive will be revealed to all present?" As the celebration continued around them, Alira felt the crown jewels gradually dim on her head, their work completed. She had been tested by ancient magic and found true. Her love was genuine, her intentions pure, her royal heritage authentic, and her choice freely made. The simple wedding ring on her finger caught the candlelight, reflecting rainbow patterns that seemed to dance with joy. It was beautiful, not because of its material value, but because it represented something that had seemed impossible just days ago, a love strong enough to overcome political barriers, social conventions, and even armed opposition. "No regrets?" Daemon asked quietly, his arm around her waist as they watched their unlikely coalition of supporters celebrate their union. "Only one," she replied, smiling up at him. "I regret that it took me 28 years to find the courage to ask you that question. And I regret that it took me 28 years to truly see the woman who had been in my castle all along." The unity chalice pulsed once more on the altar, as if blessing their mutual recognition, and the love that had transformed them both from lonely rulers into partners ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. The new royal seal gleamed in the morning sunlight as Queen Alira pressed it into warm wax for the first time, officially marking the decree that would reshape how the kingdom treated its most vulnerable citizens. The seal itself was a work of art, commissioned to represent the union of two hearts and the merging of different worlds. Instead of traditional symbols of war and conquest, it featured intertwined vines representing growth and connection, with a crown that sat not above common symbols but integrated among them. 6 months had passed since that tumultuous night in the Great Hall, and the kingdom had settled into rhythms that would have seemed impossible before. Queen Alira, still adjusting to the title that felt both natural and strange, had spent her time learning statecraft from King Daemon, while teaching him lessons of her own about seeing the kingdom from the ground up. "The orphanage project is approved," she said, setting down the seal and reviewing the document she'd just sanctioned. "Construction begins next week, and Marta has agreed to oversee the kitchen operations." Daemon looked up from his own correspondence with a smile that had become more frequent and genuine over the months of their marriage. "And the literacy program for servant children? Funded and staffed. We found teachers willing to work in the evenings, and several noble families have volunteered their libraries." She paused, remembering her own childhood spent scrubbing floors while noble children learned languages and mathematics. "Every child in this kingdom will have the chance to learn, regardless of the circumstances of their birth." The changes hadn't come easily. Some nobles had initially resisted the new queen's reforms, grumbling about the cost of educating servants and the disruption of traditional hierarchies. But resistance had faded as they witnessed the genuine improvements in the kingdom's stability and prosperity. When people felt heard and valued, Alira had discovered, they worked harder and complained less. "Any word from Astoria?" Daemon asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Prince Roderick writes that his father has formally acknowledged my claim to the succession," Alira replied, unable to hide her amazement even after months of similar recognitions. "He's invited us for a state visit next spring to discuss, how he put it, a peaceful transition when the time comes." The political landscape had indeed shifted dramatically. King Edmund's nephew, now in his 70s and without a clear heir, had ultimately decided that acknowledging Alira was preferable to leaving his kingdom in dispute after his death. The alternative, civil war between competing claimants, held no appeal for a man who had spent decades trying to bring stability to the mountain realm. And Victor, Daemon's voice carried the edge it always held when discussing the Prince of the Shadowlands. "Silent since his soldiers failed to return," Alira said with satisfaction. "Our intelligence suggests he's dealing with internal problems. Apparently his nobles are questioning his judgment after the public failure of his claims. Some are even suggesting he's unfit to rule if he can't accept a simple rejection." The defeat in Valdris had indeed damaged Victor's reputation across the region. His insistence on claiming a woman who had publicly and magically demonstrated her preference for another man made him appear weak, desperate, and out of touch with reality. Several of his own vassals had quietly reached out to other kingdoms, exploring alternative alliances that didn't depend on his increasingly erratic leadership. A knock at the chamber door interrupted their morning review. Captain Marcus entered with his usual formal bow, but his expression carried news of significance. "Your Majesties, we have visitors. A delegation from the free cities of the eastern coast requesting an audience." Alira exchanged glances with Daemon. The free cities were a confederation of merchant states that had maintained careful neutrality in regional politics for decades. For them to send official representatives suggested something important was developing. "What do they want?" Daemon asked. "To propose a trade alliance, Your Majesty, but they've specifically requested to negotiate with Queen Alira directly. It seems word of her unique perspective has reached their council. Alira felt a familiar thrill at the recognition. Her background as a servant had given her insights into the daily workings of the kingdom that traditional nobles often missed. She understood supply chains because she'd lived them, knew the real costs of policies because she'd experienced them, could speak to the needs of common people because she'd been one. "Schedule the meeting for this afternoon," she decided. "And Marcus, make sure the delegation understands they'll be negotiating with both of us. I may have unique insights, but Daemon and I rule as partners." After the captain left, Daemon moved to stand behind her chair, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "Still think this was all worth it? The danger, the political complications, the constant negotiations?" Alira leaned back against his solid presence, marveling at how natural it felt to have someone who supported her decisions and trusted her judgment. "More than worth it. We've created something new here, haven't we? A partnership that's changing how people think about marriage and power." Through the windows of their shared study, she could see the kingdom spreading out below them. The same view she'd watched from servants' quarters, but now seen through the eyes of someone who could actually affect change. The markets were bustling. With trade that their new policies had encouraged, the streets were cleaner thanks to public works programs, and the castle itself hummed with energy from servants who now saw paths for advancement beyond their berths. "Do you ever miss it?" Daemon asked quietly. "The simplicity of your old life, the invisibility?" "Sometimes," she admitted honestly. "There was a peace in being unknown, in having no one's expectations to live up to. But I don't miss the hopelessness. I don't miss feeling like my life didn't matter to anyone." She turned in her chair to face him fully, reaching up to touch the face that had become so dear to her. "And I could never miss this. Having someone who sees me completely, who values my thoughts and shares my dreams. Having a partner who makes me braver than I ever imagined I could be." He caught her hand and kissed her palm, a gesture that had become their private ritual. "You made me braver too. You taught me that a king's greatest strength isn't his army or his treasury. It's his willingness to be vulnerable, to admit when he needs help, to share power rather than hoard it." The new royal seal caught the sunlight again, its innovative design representing everything they'd built together. Instead of the traditional imagery of domination and conquest, it showed symbols of growth, partnership, and mutual support. It was a visual representation of how they'd chosen to rule, not as distant monarchs imposing their will, but as partners working alongside their people to create something better. "The historians are already calling our story a fairy tale," Alira said with amusement. "The servant girl who married the king and lived happily ever after." "They're missing the point," Daemon replied. "This isn't a story about a servant becoming a queen. It's a story about two lonely people who found the courage to ask for what they needed and who discovered that love shared is love multiplied." A soft chime from the castle's bells marked the hour, reminding them of the full day ahead. Meetings with advisors, audiences with citizens, decisions that would affect thousands of lives. But for this moment, in the quiet of their shared study, with sunlight streaming through ancient windows, they were simply Alira and Daemon, two people who had asked impossible questions and received miraculous answers. The kingdom of Valdris stretched out beyond their windows, prosperous and peaceful under the rule of monarchs who had learned to see strength in vulnerability, power in partnership, and hope in the radical act of asking for love rather than settling for duty. It was a new dawn indeed, not just for them, but for everyone who had witnessed what became possible when courage overcame convention and hearts chose to trust in something greater than the limitations others tried to impose. The new royal seal would mark many documents in the years to come, each one carrying forward the revolutionary idea that leaders serve best when they remember what it feels like to need help, and that the strongest kingdoms are built not on the foundation of fear, but on the bedrock of love freely given and gratefully received.